Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining my session. So for over next 25 minutes, I'm going to share how Microsoft, the inner source culture, and how it has changed the internal software development process. And please accept my apology in advance because I got the ankle injured, so I'd like to take a seat, okay? And if time allows, I will share my personal experience about transferring my open source project to Microsoft. So let me introduce myself. I'm Justin from Microsoft as a principal cloud advocate, and these are my social media. So if you follow me on either on LinkedIn or GitHub, then you will be getting a lot of the open source, a lot of news about the Microsoft open source, cloud native, and so on. And let's begin with this chart. So what does this chart look like? What does this chart look like? Oh, yeah, everyone knows that. So that's right. So it's a share price history of Microsoft for over last 35 years. So as you can see, it's not been very fluctuating until 2014 or 2015, right? But from that year, from the 2015, something has happened to Microsoft. So what do you think it was? So what has made this kind of dramatic change, which is 8 times higher than 10 years ago? Because the share price doesn't lie. So we can say that there must be something has changed within Microsoft for over the last 10 years. Now, we can bring up many reasons to explain that, but I think that the changes of the software development process have fundamentally transformed the organizational culture. So throughout this session, I'd like to share how the inner source approach has transformed the internal Microsoft software development process. Then I'd like to share my personal experience as an open source project maintainer to get supported by the engineers from Microsoft. So all of us here know that how important the open source ecosystem is, right? And how open source culture is. So let's start discussion with this. So whenever you are contributing any open source project, you see these things all the time, right? So what sort of changes they have made? And what are the intentions of the change? And what kind of decision-making process they have do? And who would take care of those changes, right? We can see these things every time because it's just there, right? So what does this really mean to us? It's all about transparency, right? So we can't hide anything related to the code changes, except the recent XJet, the thing. But anyway, so it's not possible to hide those discussions at all. So if you want to, you can browse anything about the change through the code change history and code review and so on. So this is the real differentiator of an open source project, right? And this is the unique factor of the open source project. And how can we get this transparency? It's because an open source project requires the collaborations between members, right? And in other words, throughout the open source project, we work together with all members, and this working together itself is also open. Therefore, it has become a unique, the open source culture. It looks like an ideal world. So many organizations tried to integrate this open source culture with their organizational culture. But the most organizations met kind of resistance. For example, people say within the organization, they will say, why should we open our source code? Because it's our intellectual property. So why should I open that? I think that's a reasonable resistance, and that's understandable, right? And this kind of friction is expected. But it's kind of based on misunderstandings about adopting open source culture into our organization stuff, right? So have you heard of this name, Tim O'Reilly? Yeah, so that's correct. That's O'Reilly, right? So the founder of O'Reilly Media, Safari Books, and so on. So in year 2000, through his email conversation, so he introduced the concept of the inner source. He brought the open source style collaboration to the software development industry. But at that time, many companies have already adopted similar approaches to their organizations, right? So they ran their internal software development process that mimicked the open source project. In other words, they only borrowed the concept of the open source project. But that didn't work well because of that kind of resistance, right? So therefore, so companies adopting those inner source approach, they should have understood about, like they don't have an obligation to follow the open source licensing model like GPL or MIT or whatsoever. In other words, even if their product look like an open source project, so they don't have to use the open source licensing models nor open their organization's source code because they are all the intellectual property. Instead, all they need to do is to introduce their open source culture into their companies and blend this kind of concept into their organizational culture. That's what O'Reilly suggested in his email conversation as inner source. So what are those open source culture, by the way? I mentioned these attributes earlier, right? So these are the ones belong to the open source cultures. And by achieving these factors, companies will become more transparent and accountable and collaborative. And let's take a look at this example. So you might have seen this picture, this illustration, talking about the organization culture of each big tech company, right? So it was drawn by one of Google's employees on his personal website. And there is a Microsoft. And like the Amazon, where is it? Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, and Oracle, and Microsoft. So I'm not going to say anything about the other companies because I have never worked that before. But it caught my attention about Microsoft, what Microsoft used to be back in the day before I joined Microsoft. So everything was top-down, and from the leadership to individual engineers. And each team compete with each other. They even hurt each other. Their collaboration was kind of less than ideal, and transparency between teams was lower than expected. So of course, there must have been some level of collaborations, but that's not in ideal ways. So back in 2014, when Satya becomes the CEO of Microsoft, he told all the engineers in Microsoft like that. Let's take an open source project concept for an internal product development process. In other words, any engineer at Microsoft should be able to see the project owned by other teams and even contribute to them at any time. Therefore, all the product development process have adopted this inner source concept. So they don't have to open their code base to the public because they are all intellectual properties. But they started following the open source project cultures. And even more, nowadays, many of those products are running as open source project basis. So those projects are now have got huge the community base and grow together. And there are many organizations on GitHub. So GitHub has many of the GitHub organizations, and this is one example. So Microsoft hosts open source project. This github.com/Microsoft is one of them. So more than 1,000 projects are running as open source projects, regardless they are big or small. And more than 4,000 engineers are involved into this one GitHub organization. Another one. This is another example of GitHub organization run by Microsoft called Azure. So github.com/Azure. So it hosts more than 2,000 open source projects, and more than 2,000 engineers have contributed to those open source projects. And I'm one of them. Let's take a look at this screenshot as well. So it's about .NET Aspire, which is the container orchestration engine of building cloud-native applications. This is just an example how Microsoft open sources their product and communicate with developer communities, not just with employees. So through these issues and PRs, Microsoft shows off a certain feature as a preview or as a part of ongoing maintenance. Then try their feature and give feedback by raising issues or PRs. So from there, both Microsoft and communities start discussion for those improvements. And while .NET Aspire remains an open source project, there are other projects that use the same open source concept or approach, which we call inner source. So this documentation project isn't just an example. So mainly, these documents are maintained by employees. But all the discussions and collaborations are made with this open source way, which we call inner source. So by doing so, so anyone can see the discussion, how Microsoft delivers their content on like learn.microsoft.com. And this is another example, how Microsoft actively uses the inner source approach. So instead of doing those discussions on their internal discussion tool like Microsoft Teams, they do all the code reviews and discussions directly on the GitHub repository, which makes those discussions more transparent. You know, they are not just the product or services that I got involved as an engineer. These are like I'm involved. I participated in those discussions or those projects as an end user perspective or external collaborator perspective. But the consequences are different. I got to influence them with my suggestions and ideas, and even my suggestions and ideas got accepted by the product team. And also, they influenced me with the way I work in those like collaborative environments. So how was it possible? Because the product team shares their directions and shows how quickly adapt the community feedback to their product and service improvement. So it's not just about starting to use GitHub repository. The real changes I felt since I joined Microsoft in 2019 are listening to others as colleagues or companions, respecting others like companions instead of treating them as competitors. So we all realize that we grow together by helping each other. That's the most fundamental changes by adopting this open source culture as inner source culture. So for over the last 10 years, Microsoft has transformed their development culture to the inner source. Throughout this journey, Microsoft has learned many things. And one of the key learnings is sustainability. The open source ecosystem should be healthier enough. Otherwise, the entire software development ecosystem will go bad. So what was the cause that Microsoft changed their mind? Was it because of the Satya's declaration in 2014? So let's go back to 20 years ago, which is year 2001. The former CEO, Steve Ballmer, even told that Linux is a cancer, right? But now in 2020, Microsoft has admitted they were wrong about the open source because they found that they learned a lot, and they found that how this open source culture has transformed their internal development process. Therefore, from the year 2020, Microsoft started running this website called Open at Microsoft. And in there, we declare community resources like code of conduct, license sharing policies for community contributors, and third-party license compliance policies, and open source project guidelines. So if you want to see more about the Microsoft approaches to open source, please visit this URL, aka.ms/open@Microsoft. And even more proactively to support the open source ecosystem, Microsoft has been running the FOSS Fund program since 2020. So every month, any employees who have contributed to open source projects are eligible to vote to the nominated open source project. Then the project that got the most vote will receive the $10,000 US dollars for a year. So let's move on to my personal experience about Microsoft Inner Source. I've got a few open source projects I'm personally running, and one of them was transferred to Microsoft official product. So this is as a function project. It started as an open source project since 2016. And it has become one of the most popular serverless products of Azure cloud landscape. However, until late 2018, it delayed supporting Open API integration, which was de facto standard for like an API integration area. So there were a lot of requests to support that the feature from the developer communities. But the product team didn't make a commitment when this feature would be available. So I started this project in late 2018 to fill the gap on Azure Functions service. So this is also an open source project. It initially started my personal and toy project, but it was rebranded in 2021 and has become an official Microsoft product. So what this extension does is that it automatically generates the OpenAPI document on the fly. And because of this extension, the Azure Functions API will have more improved discoverability by other applications, which is a really important feature in the service integration area and cloud native application development area. Because my extension got a lot of attentions from the developer community, the product team and I started discussion for migration in 2020. And finally, we completed those transfer in 2021. And right after that migration, it was introduced at Build conference as a key component for the service integration. Now this extension marks marks nearly 8.5 million downloads in total. And this extension is even used for semantic kernel, which is Microsoft's most popular AI agent SDK, which is equivalent to the LangChain. No, the bragging is enough. So what's the point of key takeaways while migrating this open source project to Microsoft? In terms of the inner source project, inner source point of view, there are some differences on the open source project policies between individual and organization. An open source project run by individuals have some level of freedom, but less structured. On the other hand, open source project run by organizations has less freedom, but highly structured, right? Both have goods and bads, so I wouldn't judge which is better for now. What about the sustainability perspective? So one of the most concerns using an open source project run by a few individuals is sustainability. So if that open source project is no longer maintained, what will happen? In fact, I've got several open source projects solely run by myself. So if I am busy because of the work, those projects are not maintained for a while until I got some spare time. However, if that project is backed by a team of several people, then there are people other than myself, so these sort of concerns go away. And this is one of the benefits using inner source approach, which is integrate-ability. So I can easily integrate the features with internal features by getting support from the product engineers. So if I am from outside, it won't be easier to integrate with these kind of the features with other products and services because of the numerous reasons. Another one, was one of my key learnings. Sometimes a breaking change would be inevitable at some stage, right? And if we meet this situation, we must choose either dropping backward compatibility or keeping it compatible. Because Azure Functions is a platform service, it's really important to keep the backward compatibility at some stage. Personally, I learned a lot about this backward compatibility, like when to support, by when to support, from when to drop, what to keep, how to let developers know, and so on. So these learnings are based on the organization culture, and it was dissolved into our inner source culture. Yeah, so that concludes my talk today. So throughout this session, I discussed how Microsoft adopted the inner source approach to draw their recent innovation, and my personal learnings from that inner source culture to build an internal product and transfer from open source to the official product. Yep, that's it from me.